Today you're going to work on taking the square roots from a solving quadratic problem. Please get out your tracking sheet in front of you. At this time, we should be looking at 3b, solve by taking the square root. You should take a highlighter and go ahead and highlight 3b for me, please. You notice that the success criteria says, if necessary, using inverse operations, get square term or parentheses alone. We are going to then square root both sides. We are then going to apply the rule of plus or minus to your answer when using a square root. And finally, we're going to solve for the two x values. We're going to go through this example on your tracking sheet. So my first step says, if necessary, you're going to use inverse operations to get squared term or parentheses by itself. So what that means is we need to get this squared parenthesis completely by itself. So in order to do that, we need to get rid of our plus 10. The opposite of plus 10 is minus 10. So I'm going to subtract 10 to both sides. My 10's on the left side cancel, and I'm going to drop down what I have left, which is x plus 3 squared equals 26 minus 10, which is 16. Now I have my I have my square roots alone and my squares alone. We're now going to move on to the second success criteria that says we are going to square root both sides. I square root both sides of my equation. Now, when we square root a square sign, they cancel out, and we are just left with the stuff inside my parentheses, which is x plus 3. When I take the square root of 16, I get plus or minus negative 4. So that is the third success criteria. Whenever you square root a perfect square, it's always plus or minus. Now, our last step is to solve for our two x values. So I'm going to do this, x plus 3 equal to a positive 4. And I also need to do x plus 3 equal to negative 4. I need to solve for my x's. In order to get my x by itself, I'm going to minus 3 to both sides. My 3's cancel. I'm left with x equals 4 minus 3, which is 1. There's one of my x values. Now we need to solve the other one. I'm going to minus 3 over here, minus 3. And now I have negative 4 minus 3, which is negative 7, which is my other x value. Make sure that you have this down on your tracking sheet or on a piece of notebook paper to reference when you go to your practice. We are going to do two other problems together. Here's the next one. 4x plus 2 squared equals 25. Remember, our first success criteria says to make sure that my parentheses that are squared are by itself on the equal sign, which it is. So now I can move on to the next step, which is simply to square root both sides. I know when I square root both sides of something with a squared, my squared and the square root cancel, leaving me with just what's inside my parentheses. When I square root a perfect square, it equals plus or minus my square root of 5. Now I need to set both of those equal to a positive 5 and one to a negative 5 and solve for my x. Okay, let's work on the first one. I want my x to stay, so I cover up 4x. In order to get rid of the plus 2, I subtract 2 to both sides of my equal sign. My 2's cancel, and I'm left with 4x equals 5 minus 2, which is 3. And finally, in order to get rid of that times 4, I divide by 4 to both sides. My 4's cancel, and I get x equals 1.3 for one of my x values. Now I have to solve when it equals negative 5. So same thing, I'm minusing 2 to both sides. My 2's cancel, and I'm left with 4x equals -5 minus 2 is -7. Now I divide by 4 to both sides. 4's cancel. -7 divided by 4 is -1.75. And I have my two x values, so I'm finished. Let's look at one more example. Remember, my first step is to get my squared parentheses or term by itself. So I need to get rid of that -2. So I add 2 to both sides of my equal sign. My 2's cancel, and I'm just left with parenthesis x minus 3 parentheses squared equals 121. Now I move on to my next success criteria, which is to take the square root of both sides. Remember, the square root and the squared cross off and just leave me what's inside my parentheses, which is x minus 3. I take the square root of 121, and that is plus or minus 11. Now I need to set both of those equal. So I have x minus 3 equals positive 11, and x minus 3 equals negative 11. I want x by itself, so I do the inverse, which is plus 3 to both sides. My 3's cancel, and 11 plus 3 is 14. I have one of my x values. I add 3 to both sides. Negative 11 plus 3 gives me a -8, which is my other x value. Remember, you always want two x values.